Hi everyone, Matt Stead here for your Uke Theory number 2, the major scales. Yesterday we looked at the chromatic scale, which is this one written here. Today we're going to look at major scales. Major scales are really important in ukulele music, but any form of music whatsoever, for various reasons. First of all, they're the most common scale which is used for composing. So over hundreds of years, loads of classical composers, modern pop composers have used these notes to compose pieces of music. So if you can understand the scale, you can understand why they've created a piece of music. You can guess what notes might be involved. It's brilliant. Next up, these scales, the major scales, are used to create chords, and we'll look at that later on. It's going to be incredibly important, but major scales are the basis of diatonic chords. That will all be explained in another video, don't worry. So two really important reasons to learn these scales. The third one is that if you can learn two of these major scales, which I'll show you later on, we can learn the whole of this fretboard, all the different notes all over the fretboard, and we'll see that later on or in the next video. So major scales are the ones that are instantly recognisable from your days at school. Do a deer, a female deer, ray a drop of golden sun, me a name I call myself, far a long way to run. Sew a needle sewing thread, la the note that follows so, tea a drink with jam and bread, and that brings us back to do. Right, everyone knows that from The Sound of Music. One of the most well-known scales in the history of music. It's only 7 notes. Think of this as all the available notes in the world, because it is. And back in the day, someone handpicked these 7 notes because they sound beautifully harmonious together. And what we do to create any major scale is we apply a formula to the chromatic scale. Okay, and the formula is as follows. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That can also be thought of as tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. I prefer wholes and halves because they're just easier to explain. Okay, so remember from our video yesterday that a whole step is when we have 2 movements along the chromatic scale. So for instance, A to B would be a whole step, because we're going A sharp, B. A half step is when we move only 1 movement along that chromatic scale. So for instance, A to A sharp would be a half step. Okay, and all we do to learn any major scale is to apply this formula to the chromatic scale. Let's look at the C major scale. It's one of the easiest scales because it has no sharps and flats in it. And the C major scale, to work it out, all we do is we write down the first note of the scale, which can be called the tonic, if you're interested. You don't need to know that yet, but that's the word for the first note in a scale. So we write down the tonic of the scale, and then we start to apply this formula. So if I want to go a whole step, up from a C, I go 2 movements along the chromatic scale, gives me D, okay? Because I've gone C, C sharp, D. I want to go another whole step now, so I go D, D sharp, E. Notice that the next one in our formula is a half step. So from E, a half step, 1 movement, gives you F. And if you remember from the last video, because elephants fart, there's no E sharp. Tick that one off. Then we go a whole step from F, F, F sharp, G. We do another whole step from G, G, G sharp, A. We're going to go back to the start. Imagine this scale goes on forever and ever, but we can only fit so much on the whiteboard. So we're going to go back to this A here. And we're going to go another whole step, A sharp, B. And then this last one, those are your 7 notes in your major scale. This last one is really just a stop check to make sure that you've done it right. Because if you apply this last one, which is a half a step from B, it should take you back to the start, okay? Back to where you started, to C. So those are your 7 notes of your major scale. That one's probably, a lot of you will have played that on your ukulele already. Don't worry if you thought I did that too quickly. I'm going to show you how to play these scales and how to use it to learn the fretboard later on in this video or in the next one if I start to run out of time. So you will learn them, don't panic. But just for now, let's carry on looking at how these scales are formed. So you'll notice that the C major scale has no sharps or flats in it. Now, every major scale has a specific amount of sharps and flats in it. So it could have, for instance, F has 1 flat, G has 1 sharp, and certain scales have lots of sharps or just a few flats, as you'll see as we go along. This will help to kind of explain why sometimes notes are called sharps and sometimes notes are called flats as well. Let's have a look at the F major scale next. We're going to construct that one using exactly the same formula. And you'll notice that this one is going to have a flat note in it, and I'll show you how. What we're going to do is we're going to start with F. The reason I'm doing C and F incidentally is because later on I'm going to show you the C major scale and the F major scale on the ukulele fretboard, and those 2 scales will help you to learn all of the notes on the fretboard. So that's why I've chosen those 2. It's just quite arbitrary really. So we're going to start from F and we're going to apply this scale again. I'll put the dots on the top this time. So we're going to go from F, a whole step takes us to G, okay? Now from G, we apply another whole step, takes us to A, okay? Remember, a whole step, just 2 movements along that scale. Now, the next one is a half step. Now, a half step from A would take you to A sharp, right? Because we've just gone 1 movement along the scale. Now, this is the reason why sometimes notes are called sharps and sometimes they're called flats. And the long and short of it is that we don't like to have 2 notes with the same letter. An A and an A sharp on a piece of sheet music gets really confusing to the eye. So all we do is we call it something different. So rather than calling it an A sharp, we call it a B flat. Exactly the same note, right? But it just means that we've got 2 different letters here, so it's a lot less confusing when you read it on the stave. And that's why it's a flat and not a sharp. It's that simple in every key. I'll show you another one in a minute so you can see that. So that's our half step. We keep applying the formula, so we're going to go a whole step now up from B flat, do, do. Oh, sorry, I went from B then, from B flat, do, do. Takes us to C. We do another whole step from C, C, C sharp, D, making sure we tick it off. Another whole step from D, D, D sharp, E. And then remember, this last one is a stop check to make sure that the letter is the one we started off. And if you have a look, a half step from E is F. So we've gone back to the start. So that's all of the notes in the key of F. I'm going to do one more because I want to show you, really hammer home why some are sharps and some are flats again, so you can really see it. Let's look at one more. I know this is a bit dry, but this should really help some of you. So let's have a look at G, okay? Another reason I've chosen these ones is these are the most common keys that you'll find in ukulele music. So let's have a look at the key of G. G major this is. Remember, we're looking at major scales. So we're going to start from G and we're going to go a whole step, G, G sharp, A, along here. Let's do circles so we can see what we've done. Now, the next one is we're going to do, whoops, that should have been there, sorry. Next up, we're going to apply a whole step from A, which is A, A sharp, B. Okay. The next one is a half step from B. 1 movement along gives us C. Okay, tick it off. The next one is a whole step from C. C, C sharp, D. Tick it off. The next one is a whole step from D, so D, D sharp, E. Tick it off. Next one is a whole step from E, so E, F, F sharp. And then to finish off, we have a half step to take us from F sharp, should take us back to the start again, which it does. So there's our key of G major. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this one is notice that this is called an F sharp. Now, an F sharp can also be called a G flat, right? It's the same note. The reason we can't call that a G flat is because if we did, we'd have two forms of G, which again is really confusing when you look at sheet music. So quite simple, quite easy to get once you see it written out like that. That is why we call that an F sharp and not a G. And that's why in some keys, some notes are thought of as a sharp, and in others they're thought of as a flat. It's just as simple as that, basically. And that's how you construct all your major scales. Now, let's see if we could play one of these on a ukulele fretboard. So let's have a look. Let's do the key of C major to start with, okay? Now, C major is nice because we have no sharps or flats, okay? And we could write it out here, C, D, we'll play a D here. Let's get rid of that so we can put an E in here. E, F, G, A, B, C. Okay, so those are all the notes from the C major scale. Now, just for a second before we play that on the ukulele, let me show you what that looks like on the keyboard. Sometimes it really helps to visualize it. So I'm going to explain about the whole and half steps as we go. So we start with C. And we apply a whole step, which means two movements. D. Another whole step, two movements. E. The next one is a half step. Notice there's no black notes there, no black key there. So a half step takes me to here. And you'll see as I go along that the key of C major has no sharps or flats in it at all. Now if I start the same thing starting from F, so we can do our F major scale, notice that the scale of F has this one flat in it. Okay, sharps and flats are the black notes on your keyboard. Let's go back to playing that on our ukulele then. So, C major scale. Just going to pick these with our thumb on the right hand side of the ukulele, not too bothered. You could use your finger if you wanted to. Okay, we're just going to pick the notes individually, and we're going to pick a low C note, which is your second string down, physically down, C string open for a C note. Next up, we're going to play a D at the second fret. Now, how do we know that's a D? Remember from the last video, we can work it out using the chromatic scale, because this string here is an open C. This one would be C sharp. That's your next note on your chromatic scale. And the next one would be D. That's how we know that's a D. So we've got an open C, second fret for D. We're going to play an E open. We're going to play an F at the first fret of the E string. We're going to play the G at the third fret of the E string. We're going to play an A open. We're going to play a B at the second fret of the A string. And then we're going to have a high C here, third fret of the A string. So if we put that together. Now as you practice this, I want you to say the notes out louder in your head. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Will help you to learn those notes. Now remember, just like we looked at in the last video, we don't want to use one finger because that's really awkward. We want to correspond the fingers of our left hand with the frets. So any note that comes, well, any string that has no fingers at all is easy. Any note that comes on the first fret, we use our first finger. Any note that comes on a second fret, second finger. Any note that comes on the third fret, third finger. So you get this nice smooth. Okay, that's your C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Okay, fantastic. That's how your major scales are formed. In the next video, I'm going to show you the F major scale up the fretboard. We're going to use that to learn the whole of this ukulele fretboard. What we're also going to do is we're going to learn a couple of really basic rudimentary tunes which use these scales. So we're going to pick out some tunes as well, okay, to help you learn these scales. Okay, I'll see you next time. Uke on and stay safe.